Hello, and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Joining me today on the show is North Dakota State University political science professor Nick Baroff. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me today.
Nick, as we get started, before we talk about sort of the statewide and national elections and things coming up, tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, and where you're from.
All right. Well, originally I'm from Western Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, and I went to school at Loyola University in Chicago, which is where I got my PhD, and I've been in Fargo since 2004, so hopefully I've picked up a thing or two over the years. So.
Well, good. So what brought you to NDSU?
Well, they were hiring for one thing, because I had been teaching year to year in Georgia, and that was fine, but you know, I was having a family, and Fargo looked good, looked like a good place to raise a family, so here I am.
Good. Well, there are any number of things we're going to talk about today with all the elections, but let's start the measures that are out there. I think I heard about 8 measures, but there's some interesting ones. Can you highlight some of them for us?
Yeah, I mean, they're all interesting in that they'll have a big effect on the way the state is run and its institutions. The one that will get the most attention is, nationally, if it gets passed, is, well, I brought a list just so I don't get them mixed up, is the first one, which is relating to the inalienable rights to life for every human being at every stage of development. And that would be something that would get a lot of attention nationwide, because there have been attempts to pass these things in other states, and they've been unsuccessful. And this is seen as something that would be, well, possibly will do away with abortion in North Dakota, and possibly seen as something that could be an interesting test case in the Supreme Court. So that's the one that would get the most attention. The one that has seemed to get a lot of attention from business and nonprofits and such is the Measure 5, which is the conservation measure, having to do with money being spent on conservation efforts and such. And you see a lot of letters to the editor, a lot of business organization, oil groups and such coming out against it, and also a number of environmental groups that are for it. And there have been a back and forth about whether or not this is really a North Dakotan measure or if it's sponsored by outsiders and such. And so that's the one that also I would keep an eye on closely. And of course, for my own self-interest, number 3, where they're talking about revamping the existing Board of Higher Education. There's a back and forth about what that might mean for the university system. So I'll be watching that one closely myself.
Sure. And as you mentioned, even highlighting those 3 measures, obviously there are different vocal parties on each side of that. And I don't mean political parties, I just mean, so it'd be interesting to watch how that plays out. Well, then let's go to the election. Of course, non-presidential year, but maybe an interesting year.
Yeah, I mean, 2010 was the one that seemed to be the Super Bowl in terms of transformative midterm elections, but this one could be quite historic as well. The big question is whether or not which party will control the U.S. Senate after it's done. It seems to be pretty much, most people are believing that the House will stay in Republican hands, that there would have to be some unforeseen historic changes, voting patterns for that to change.
In fact, they may gain a few seats.
They could well, yeah, because usually the party of the president does poorly in these midterm elections, and they usually will suffer more in the House. Now, the U.S. Senate is where most of our political scientists are paying close attention, because it's really close now. The Democrats have the upper hand, but you have a swing of 5 seats. Suddenly the Republicans are calling the shots. And so if you look on a state-by-state basis, in a lot of ways this is sort of like the Democrats have been dealt a poor hand, because they're running elections in states that, well, either voted for Mitt Romney or President Obama is not very popular in. So we're talking about states like Louisiana and Alaska and such. And the Republicans, well, the latest polls in those states seem to be gaining the upper hand. And so right now, if you're a Republican, national party person, you would be thinking that you'd like your chances going in. But again, we've still got a ways to go. And some of those elections, it's kind of hard to get a grasp on what's going on in Alaska. And some states that would seem to be an easy win for the Republicans, such as Kansas, suddenly it's been a whole lot of strange politics going on. And so, well, we'll probably have a long night, I think, the election night, to see who will win control of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, and it could turn out 50-50.
Yeah, and if that happens, Vice President Biden's going to be camping out in the Senate, because he would be the one casting the deciding vote on a 50-50 split.
Okay. Well, with that said, the economy seems to be a little better maybe than when President Obama took office, but yet the economy doesn't seem to be an issue right now. Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly better, and it certainly doesn't seem to be, about to fall off a cliff like it was maybe 4 or 6 years ago. But it doesn't seem particularly robust, And it seems like you have one good month of growth and it's falling back, and then another good night and then it falls back. So it's kind of hard to get a consistent pattern. And the way that political science usually looks at it is that when you're coming into election, usually people have made up their minds about whether the economy is good or not, maybe about 4 or 6 months ahead of time. So even if suddenly there's a string of good economic reports coming out in terms of employment or economic growth, it's probably not going to help the Democrats or President Obama too much for this election. Again, it doesn't seem to be something that people are focusing on as the economy's dragging down the Democrats, but it's just not seen as as a positive these days.
Mm-hmm. What do you attribute President Obama's approval numbers to, considering just a couple of years ago he won over Mitt Romney?
Well, it's one of the things that usually tends to happen is by the time you're getting to the 6th year of a presidential administration, people are just sick of the president, whether it's Clinton, Bush, Reagan. People usually are saying, all right, we've had these fights that go on, and we're starting to think about maybe, we're getting to the end in the lame duck year and such. So usually presidents aren't going to be doing quite so well when they get this last portion. And you had a number of things that happened in the world that, in Iraq, in Ukraine and so forth, that seemed that implied the world's a much more dangerous place and a lot more difficult to control and assert American will. And I think that's hurt as well. And again, the economy is not being robust, and if it was, if you had steady 5% economic growth, suddenly, like Bill Clinton, looking back in retrospect, Obama might look a lot better. So I think it's just sort of voter fatigue and just a general sort of sense that the world's in disarray for no matter whose fault it might be. President Obama's right there right now.
Mm-hmm. What about foreign policy? Is that really chipping away at his effectiveness, or is that story really overplayed?
Well, it might be overplayed a little bit because it's easy to get excitable with some of the things that are going on. But President Obama had been seen, at least in the opinion polls, as somebody who had been doing quite well in terms of fighting terrorism and maintaining peace. And so that aspect might have been chipped away at. And so I don't think the elections are going to be decided about foreign policy. I think there's a lot of state and national things that are driving it. But it's like one less positive that he probably has going for him. And again, you're coming into a midterm election, and the party of the president's going to be, traditionally does much worse, and this just isn't going to help.
Well, with that said, so is he a drag on the ticket for the Democrats, or will they distance themselves or try to use him?
Well, it depends on which state you're in.
Sure.
I mean, if you're in New York State, probably not going to be a drag on the ticket. If you're in Louisiana or Arkansas or some of the other southern states where they have, where the Republicans have been supporting, might have supported McCain or Romney, they're probably not going to bring him in. He certainly is going to be quite useful in terms of fundraising, and President Obama, in terms of getting out the vote, has proved effective in several elections. So it's not as if he's a total drag. But in the states where the Democrats have to win, the Senate seats, he's not going to be a positive, net positive. And so in those areas where they have to win, unfortunately for the Democrats, they've come up sort of snake eyes. Those candidates have to survive on their own and sort of play down their connection that they might have with President Obama.
Okay. Well, what about Obamacare, the affordable health care? Is that as much an issue now or not?
It seems to be less of an issue in that you can't run a campaign saying I'm against Obamacare now, like you might have been able to do in 2010. But it hasn't added up to, or at least the polls have seen to show, that it hasn't added up yet as a net positive for the Democrats or Obama. It seems to be an issue that for a lot of people has played itself out. There was a back and forth. But again, it's going to be one of those things that might get established and become a permanent program. But for the short term, there doesn't be any boost for the Democrats. And while they don't seem necessarily to be running away from the issue like they used to, they haven't been putting it front and center. So, because again, if you're trying to get away from sort of the getting to a lame duck president, you don't want to be maybe associated with his landmark achievement domestically.
Okay. Well, let's turn our focus over, I guess, to North Dakota and Minnesota a little bit. First off, let's start with North Dakota congressional seat. Of course, the incumbent Kevin Cramer, Democratic candidate George Center, and then Libertarian Jack Seaman. How do you see this race?
Well, it's hard to tell because, unfortunately for North Dakota, if we had like a Senate seat that was up for grabs, we'd be getting regular polls, or at least every once in a while, and we haven't had them so far here. There was a poll released by I believe the Democratic Party saying that Sinner was close to Kramer, that it was a dead heat, but you had to take that stuff with a grain of salt. That being said, if I'm watching this race, I would think it would be a competitive one for a couple of reasons. One, Sinner is, the name is fairly well known in North Dakota. In terms of the incumbency advantage for Kramer, well, he's probably not, he certainly has some advantages, but he's not as entrenched as, say, somebody who's been there for 5 or 6 terms. So if you're going to knock off an incumbent like Kramer, this is the election to do it. And, well, I'll be interested to see how the Libertarians do. They are on several, they've gotten their status as a party in North Dakota, and they've gotten a few of their nominees on the ballot. And so it'll be interesting to see if they do more than, you know, their traditional 0.5% or less sort of vote, or if they can get a few percent or more. Because if it is a competitive race, if that Democratic poll is reflecting some sort of reality, 2%, 3%, 5% could make a real margin. So, you know, again, if I was a betting man, I'd still put it down on Kramer, you know, incumbent, North Dakota, midterm elections and everything. But I expect that it should be something that we might, again, have to stay up a little bit later than we expect to see who's the winner.
Well, you mentioned Libertarian Party, and but as you mentioned, it hadn't been as big a factor in North Dakota, at least yet. So is it, why is all that?
Well, I think the Libertarians are sort of coming into their own in terms of how they look at themselves, that they're not necessarily thinking of themselves as sort of a subheading of the Republican Party, that they have a different perspective on a number of things, particularly in foreign policy. And so I see on campus, and again, I don't have polls, so this is sort of my anecdotal evidence, but I do see on campus more students at least interested in the Libertarians as a party and such. So it seems like they, again, have a better sense of themselves and are able to put together a structured thing and get them on the ballot. So when you hear that, you get a sense that they could be a player. But again, you know, a minor play at that, it seems. So we'll wait and see. You know, again, it's a new wrinkle for North Dakota, and as a political scientist, I'm, you know, looking nationally. Is this something I should be, you know, gearing my lectures to now, or is this just something that, you know, is a minor issue?
Okay. Well, let's talk about some statewide races, I guess, and we'll stay with North Dakota. You know, we've got the Ag Commissioner and Tax Commissioner, but let's start with the Ag Commissioner race. How do you see that one with Taylor and Gehring?
Well, that's the one, if I'm a Democrat in the state, I would pay closest attention to, because Taylor, of course, is a prominent Democrat to run for governor before, has been a leader, I believe, in the Senate, in the state Senate, and seems to have a presence out there. I mean, I've seen a lot of ads, and it seems like he's campaigning. So it seems if the Democrats are going to become something of a player in the state in terms of creating policy and becoming competitive, that's the race to watch. Now, again, we don't have polls, so I can't really say whether he's making it through. But if I'm looking to see whether this state is going to become a competitive two-party state, that's the one I'm going to be paying attention to.
Okay. And then we have the Tax Commissioner with the issues going on there. How do you see that race?
Boy, that's a tough one, because usually you would see the controversies that come up with the Republican candidate and such. Usually you would see that as not necessarily the end of the campaign, but as something that, you know, would get a lot of attention. And I mean, it's gotten a play, it's gotten attention, but it seems to be an issue that the Democrats haven't gone through for the throat on, at least so far. And again, you know, if you're trying to see the Democrats as a competitive force, you would think that that would be something they could take advantage of, much like the Agriculture Commissioner, that they could put a message out there that, you know, entrenched Republicans need competition, or we'll get sort of a, you know, questionable policy.
So, you know, again, Republican incumbents, why is North Dakota pretty much a Republican state, it seems like?
Well, that's always a good question, one of the ones I always ask my students. And of course, we, you know, if you just say North Dakota conservative, that's it. You don't get the nuance, you know, the east side versus the west side, Fargo versus the rest of the state. But if I was coming at it from a perspective, you know, you have a pretty rural community. You have a traditional reliance on resources and agriculture. And you have a fairly homogeneous population. And so, and you have a Republican Party that has been successful in pushing the oil industry into the front with fracking and such. So those things combined make for a pretty good playing field for Republicans. Now, why is it that the Democrats haven't maintained some sort of level of competitiveness? That's the big question. And it's, in some ways, it's it's one of those things you scratch your chin on. Well, because I keep telling my students each year, well, all right, the Democrats are at this level in the House and Senate. Maybe they're a growth stock, if you're going to invest, and it doesn't seem to happen. So that's sort of a good question to ask. Why they don't pick up and become more competitive, like in Iowa or in Minnesota, which of course has a lot more differences and such. So it's a perennial question, and after this election, maybe we'll be asking it a different way. Maybe we'll be saying, hey, this was their best shot, and they didn't seem to do so well.
Well, let's move over to Minnesota for a moment and the governor's race.
Yeah.
Any chance there Mark Dayton can be beat?
Well, you never want to say never, and the Republican candidate was pointing out that he was only 9 points behind, and Minnesota seems to have recovered economically, and it seems like they've got their budget affairs in order. So there's no real reason to see why the incumbent should be pushed out. It seems, again, he seems to be running a competent electoral election, and the only way I could see him having trouble is if there was a third party that split off a significant number of votes, the independent party, and they don't seem to be doing that this year, and the Libertarians don't seem to be much of, or Greens or any other third party don't seem to be much of a factor. So if you're Dayton, people look satisfied, and the polls seem to reflect that so far. And again, he seems to be likable and doesn't seem to have done anything that has made people angry.
Okay. Well, of course, with North Dakota not having a Senate race this year, how about the Senate there in Minnesota? It would appear Al Franken has a sizable lead over McFadden.
Yeah.
How do you see this race?
Well, it's so surprising because Franken got in by just the narrowest margin the first time around, and he seemed to be pretty divisive, even amongst Democrats. So if you were the Republicans, you'd say, all right, wait 6 years, get a candidate who has something going for him, and let's see how it goes. And I guess Franken, what he has done is he hasn't played up, sort of the funny man reputation he had, and he hasn't been quite so boisterous with his opinions as he had when he was a radio host. That he has focused on casework and focused on policies that are important for Minnesota, and hasn't really done much in terms of any sort of national sort of interviews or media. And again, because he seems to be pretty effective, hasn't upset anyone, he has that incumbency advantage going for him in a state that is traditionally lean Democratic. So those seem to be, if you're Franken, seem to be some good reasons for thinking you'll do well or get reelected this fall.
Yeah, and maybe the emergence, of course, from Franken, the comedian, to now a pretty effective and it seems like hard to unseat senator.
Yeah.
So what about that? He was able to make that change.
It's all very odd because again, when I grew up, I remember seeing the old Saturday Night Live things and his movies and such, and just to picture him as a senator takes some adjustment and such. And of course, the Republican candidate has sometimes tried to say, hey, this is this guy who was, has a funny side or an irreverent side, and that's perhaps not what you want in your senator. And it doesn't, this time around doesn't seem to be having any sort of issues. And he hasn't had any of the, I guess the tax issues that came up from being a comedian the last time around. No, he's just straight-laced senator, which is, again, who knew when I was a kid?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you mentioned the Senate could change control. What would it mean if the Republicans gain control of the U.S. Senate, and especially in Obama's last 2 years?
Well, that will be an interesting thing because it's unlikely that you're going to have any sort of radical change because of course, Obama's got the veto pen. You could easily have some government shutdown sort of confrontations, hey, do this or we won't fund the government and such. And that's very possible. If I was sort of sitting down and saying, all right, we got the House and the Senate, let's see what we can do to get the presidency. If I was a Republican, what I would look at is and say, well, let's do a number of investigations. Let's pursue not only House investigations, but Senate investigations of various issues and controversies from the Obama administration's past and beyond Benghazi and such, because you can always find something that an administration has screwed up. You can always find out, whether or not, in ISIS in Iraq, why didn't we see it coming? Whatever it might be. Have a number of investigations, and what tends to happen is that, well, of course, it undermines Obama. People get sick of it. And again, I remember the 2000 elections, and one of the things that George W. Bush had going for him is that you had a Republican Congress going against a Democratic president, and so you would just have George W. Bush come in and say, hey, I'm not part of that. I'm going to, be someone who is humble and bring us together and will look like something of relief. And so if you're the Republicans in the House and Senate, just helping a Republican get into the presidency might be something. But you never know, because you could also say, hey, maybe we can do an impeachment, because it's an open road for that. And that would be an interesting twist, to say the least, because President Obama has announced that he's going to make some changes through executive action regarding immigration policy. And what those might be is, well, up in the air, but would probably allow quite a number, several hundred millions perhaps, of people who are here right now stay or refile and change the way that things are done in terms of deportations and such, and something that would be quite sweeping. And it has been mentioned that that might be something that if you're a Republican House and Senate, House that would do the impeachment, of course the Senate would do the trial, and that would be something that could happen. So if I'm saying, hey, cold-blooded, rational, let's see about getting a Republican elected, perhaps the investigation route will be the way to go. But if you get going with policy and people trying to change things, well, sky's the limit, I suppose.
Well, all right, let's turn away, I guess, from this year and look forward. 2016, it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton will probably be in the race.
Yeah.
Can you talk about her as a candidate going forward?
Well, she looks inevitable right now, and even more inevitable than she seemed in 2008. Never say never. Some other person might arise to take the Obama role, but she looks like the person who's at least is by far the front runner. And of course, you can say she is a known quantity, to say the least. She's been around for quite some time, from the Clinton White House up through being a senator to being Secretary of State. So she is a known quantity. And people tend to have stronger feelings both for and against her. So if you're trying to rally the Democratic base, if you think that that's the way to go, and it could well be with the electoral map that we have, she seems to be pretty ideal, because she, again, you check the polls, the Democrats have very high opinions of her and seem to be very much intending to vote for her if she's the nominee. So she certainly will be polarizing. There'll be a lot of ads and discussion about everything from the Clinton healthcare reform efforts up through her tenure in the Obama administration. So it'd be quite contentious, to say the least. But she's well-known quantity, and if nothing else, in 2008, once things got rolling, she seemed to be a pretty good campaigner. So yeah, it'll be interesting, because it's sort of like right now the Democrats, their top-tier candidates for president. Well, there's a few, but Hillary Clinton seems to be by far the #1 candidate. And that's opposed to Republicans, where it seems to be split off. There's no obvious nominee. Anyone from Christie to Rand could obviously get this. And, Mitt Romney is making a nod and a wink that perhaps he might want to get involved. And there's no clear front runner amongst that just yet, even though we're still a couple years away.
So do you have an opinion of who you think the top runner will be out of the Republican Party?
Oh my goodness, I do not, because one day I think Chris Christie has crashed and burned, and then he seems to come back, and then Rand Paul, I'm like, well, he can't. He seems to be sort of just appeals to a segment, and then he comes out with stuff that seems like he could expand his base. So it's unclear at this moment. It's not like in 2008 or 12 where it seemed to be that it was McCain or Romney's to win it. Here it could be anybody, and and legitimately make for a good candidate against the Democrats.
Okay, the demographics of a national election shifted toward a Democrat winning. Maybe even again, thanks part to Obama's getting the votes out, especially between minorities and women.
Yeah.
Is that still looking like that again?
Well, it looks good because for the Democrats in a lot of ways, not just because of the demographics, because the way the electoral map is set up is that they've managed to hold down some pretty good places like California and New York, expand into New Hampshire, and seem to be, Pennsylvania and Ohio gets contested, but they seem to have the upper hand. So when you start having a map like that, all you have to do is pick up a Florida or a few other states, and it's very hard to beat. And so, winning a Pennsylvania by a few points in some ways is more meaningful than winning, say, Texas by 20 points or in Oklahoma by 40. So although they're fairly close, Democrats and Republicans, in terms of presidential votes nationally, The electoral map has gone from what used to be traditionally strong or fairly strong for the Republicans to leaning the Democrats' way quite well these last few elections.
Mm-hmm. Is it a concern that maybe you see more Democratic voters sitting it out in the off year than?
Yeah, and that's a big concern because if you're relying, the Democratic base, whether it's younger people or whether it's people with less income or whether it's minority groups, tend to be less likely to vote in midterm elections for whatever reason. I mean, most people are less likely to vote for whatever reason, but the Democratic base seems to lag a little bit behind the Republican base. And that, of course, is Obama has been quite successful in some elections in inspiring that base, bringing them out and such. So when you get to the last few days of elections, well, people say Obama, he's being a drag. I expect to see in a number of races that Obama will be, and his organization will play a prominent role and get out the vote.
Nick, we could talk a long time on this. If people want more information, where can they go?
Well, there's a number of places to go. You can go to OpenSecrets.com to get information about funding for candidates, and you can, of course, come to NDSU and contact us and such. Right. And, of course, Secretary of State webpage. Watch that night for the elections, and you should be good.
Well, we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Post this week, and as always, thanks for watching.